My son, there's something you need to know about the day your mother and I met. His words, written on paper yellowed with age, felt colder than the metal lockbox they came from. The silence in this old farmhouse suddenly felt heavy, like it was hiding a 50-year-old secret right in plain sight. What I found after reading that first line shattered everything I thought I knew about my own life. So stay with me until the end, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether it's your city, your job, or even the sofa in your home. My name is Rosemary Callahan, and I am 78 years old. For 51 of those years, I was a wife, and for the last 6 months, I have been a widow. My hands, which once stitched the dreams of hundreds of brides into satin and lace, are now gnarled with arthritis, better suited for pulling weeds from the stubborn North Carolina clay in my garden. This farmhouse, on the quiet outskirts of Ashboro, was my world with Arthur. Now, without his deep voice humming along to the radio or the sweet, earthy scent of his pipe tobacco clinging to the curtains, the house is just a collection of rooms filled with silence and memories. The mornings are the hardest. I wake up to the sound of cardinals chattering outside the window, a sound Arthur used to love, and for a fleeting moment, I expect to smell coffee brewing. But the kitchen is always cold and still. The air is thick with the scent of damp wood from the overnight rain and the cloying sweetness of the honeysuckle climbing the porch trellis. His favorite. My life has become a routine of ghosts. I sit in his armchair. I trace his name on a dusty photograph. I listen to the cicadas buzz in the afternoon heat and pretend it's the sound of him working in his shed. Every object here is an anchor. The chipped ceramic mug he drank his tea from, the worn spot on the floor where his feet rested every evening, the faint scent of him that still lingers. In his closet. My son Robert doesn't understand that. He lives in Charlotte, a world of concrete and hurry, and he sees this place as a burden. During his last visit, he stood in the doorway, his car keys jingling impatiently in his pocket, and said the words that have become a constant, painful refrain. "You should sell this place, Mom, and get a condo near me." He says it with such practicality, as if he's talking about trading in an old car, not dismantling a life. He doesn't see the history etched into the wooden beams, or the love that settled into the foundation like bedrock. To him, it's just property, an asset to be liquidated. But for me, the thought of leaving this farmhouse feels like a second death, an erasure of the 50 years I spent becoming Mrs. Arthur Callahan. That day, I realized his visits weren't about comfort. They were about closing a chapter he was tired of reading. The greatest humiliation wasn't in his words, but in the realization that my grief was an inconvenience to my own son. The rain started around noon, a soft, steady drumming on the tin roof that usually soothed me. But today, it felt different, like it was sealing me inside with my loneliness. The silence in the house grew louder, more accusing. I couldn't stand the sight of Arthur's empty chair anymore, so I decided to do something I'd been putting off for months. I went to the small cluttered room at the back of the house that served as his workshop. I needed to feel close to him, to touch the things his hands had shaped. The room smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and time. His tools hung neatly on the pegboard, each one in its place, a testament to the methodical man he was. My eyes scanned the shelves, past the jars of screws and nails, landing on a heavy, dark green metal toolbox tucked under his workbench. It was his primary one, the one he carried for every project, its corners dented and its paint chipped from decades of use. I hadn't touched it since he passed, afraid to disturb the last place his hands had been. My fingers, stiff and aching, fumbled with the rusted latches. They snapped open with a sharp metallic clang that echoed in the quiet room. Inside, nestled amongst the familiar clutter of wrenches, pliers, and measuring tape, was something that didn't belong. It was a small, forgotten cluster of keys, bound together with a twisted piece of copper wire. They were old, tarnished with age, except for one. One key was smaller than the rest, made of brass, and it glinted faintly in the dim light from the single window. A strange feeling, a mix of dread and an electric curiosity, prickled my skin. I didn't recognize the keys, but that one small brass one felt significant, like a forgotten word on the tip of my tongue. I picked them up, the cold metal a shock against my warm palm. And then, an image surfaced in my mind, clear as day. The solid wood door at the very end of the upstairs hallway. The door that had been locked for as long as I'd lived in this house. He saw a property. I saw the last piece of my husband. I knew then that I was in a fight, not just for my home, but for my own history. That door was a silent, unquestioned part of our home's geography. The back room, Arthur used to call it. Whenever I'd asked, early in our marriage, what was behind it, his answer was always the same, delivered with a casual shrug. It's just old junk, Rosie. Stuff left over from the construction. The key was lost years ago, not worth the trouble. I believed him, of course. Arthur was a simple, honest man. Why would I ever doubt him? The door, with its heavy, antique padlock, simply became part of the house, a mystery I had no interest in solving. But now, holding this key, his words felt different. They didn't sound simple or honest anymore. They sounded like a shield. I walked out of the workshop, the keys clutched so tightly in my hand that their edges dug into my skin. The house seemed to hold its breath as I made my way to the stairs. Each step, each creak of the old floorboards, felt amplified, like a drumbeat counting down to something I couldn't name. The rain was coming down harder now, a frantic rhythm against the windows. I reached the upstairs landing and stood before the door. It looked just as it always had, imposing, silent, its white paint peeling slightly around the frame. The padlock was a dark, rusted circle against the wood, a symbol of a boundary I had respected for half a century. The air in the hallway felt colder, heavier, as if it hadn't circulated in years. I could smell dust and something else, something faint and vaguely sweet, like dried flowers. My heart was pounding in my chest, a frantic bird beating against my ribs. Part of me wanted to turn back, to put the key away and forget I ever found it, to preserve the simple peace of the life I thought I had. But Robert's voice echoed in my mind. Sell this place. And a wave of defiance washed over me. This wasn't just a house. It was my life story. And if there was a chapter that had been sealed away, I had a right to read it before it was all torn down. My hand trembled as I separated the small brass key from the others. It looked so fragile against the formidable lock. I took a deep, shaky breath, the air tasting of dust and rain. For 50 years, I had loved Arthur with a quiet, unwavering certainty. I had believed I knew every part of him, every story, every scar. But as I raised the key to the lock, I was struck by the terrifying thought that I might not have known him at all. What if it wasn't just junk behind that door? What if it was a part of him he had deliberately hidden from me? The man who shared my bed, who held my hand through sickness and sorrow, who promised me a life with no secrets. The thought was a betrayal that cut deeper than Robert's careless words. It felt as if the very ground beneath my feet was beginning to crack, threatening to swallow the life I had so carefully built. I hesitated. For a moment, the key hovering just inches from the keyhole. I thought about the easy silence we shared, the comfortable routines, the life that felt so complete. Was I about to destroy all of that? Was it better to live with a comforting lie than to face a devastating truth? The image of the condo Robert had shown me on his phone, sterile, white, and empty of memories, flashed in my mind. No, I couldn't leave this house without knowing. I had to understand the whole story. His voice echoed in my head, so clear and calm. But for the first time in 50 years, it didn't sound like the truth. It sounded like a wall. With a resolve I didn't know I possessed, I pushed the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly, a perfect fit. The sound was a dry, metallic click, but to me it was as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. It was the sound of a seal breaking, of a promise being undone. I gripped the key, my knuckles white, and turned it. There was a moment of resistance, a grating of old metal, and then the mechanism gave way with a decisive clunk. The padlock sprang open. I pulled it from the hasp, its weight surprising me. It felt like I was holding 50 years of secrets in my palm. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the unlocked door, my breath caught in my throat. The rain outside had softened to a drizzle, and a sliver of pale afternoon light filtered through the hallway window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. My hand, now free of the lock, rested on the cold brass doorknob. This was the point of no return. I knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my life was about to be divided into two parts. The time before I opened this door, and the time after. The simple narrative of my marriage, of my life with Arthur, was about to be rewritten, and I had no idea if I would recognize the story once it was finished. I felt completely and utterly cornered, trapped not by the four walls of my home, but by the sudden, terrifying expanse of the unknown. Behind me was the life I had cherished, a life that now felt fragile and possibly false. In front of me was a truth Arthur had guarded so fiercely that he locked it away. My only son wanted to erase my past, and my late husband had apparently hidden his own. The silence from the other side of the door was immense, a vacuum waiting to be filled. I thought of Arthur's face, the kind lines around his eyes, the gentle way he used to touch my cheek. Who was he? Who was the man I had given my entire life to? The question hung in the air, unanswered and terrifying. I felt a profound sense of failure, a hollow ache in my chest. How could I have lived with someone for so long and not sensed this? My fingers tightened around the doorknob. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot twisting in my stomach, making it hard to breathe. But the need to know was stronger. It was a desperate, primal urge to understand the foundation upon which my entire adult life had been built. Was it solid ground, or was it sand? I had to find out, even if it meant everything came crashing down around me. I closed my eyes, picturing Arthur one last time as the man I remembered, the man who brought me honeysuckle from the garden, who fixed the leaky faucet with a patient smile, who held me at night until I fell asleep. I held that image in my mind like a prayer, a shield against whatever lay on the other side. Then, I took one final, shuddering breath. I turned the knob. The latch clicked back, and with a low, groaning complaint of wood against wood, the door began to swing inward, opening a sliver of darkness into the dimly lit hallway. The air that drifted out was ancient, carrying the scent of cedar, old paper, and a faint, almost imperceptible trace of lavender. It was not the smell of junk. It was the smell of a place that had been deliberately preserved. My silent struggle was over. A new, louder one was about to begin. As the door swung open, the air that met me was not stale, but sacred. It was a thick, still atmosphere, carrying the clean, sharp scent of cedar wood and the ghostly sweetness of dried lavender. It was the smell of a time capsule, of a place deliberately sealed away from the world. A sliver of gray light from the hallway pierced the darkness, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in the silent air. This was no storage room filled with construction debris. This was a sanctuary. My feet felt impossibly heavy as I crossed the threshold. The floorboards didn't creak. They seemed to hold their breath along with me. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, shapes began to emerge from the shadows. A small wooden crib stood against the far wall, its bars like a tiny cage for a ghost. On a low shelf, a collection of antique wooden toys, a spinning top, a set of blocks, a small painted rocking horse, sat perfectly arranged, as if waiting for a child who had just stepped out for a moment. A wave of vertigo washed over me. I felt like a trespasser, a profaner of some holy ground. My hand went to my mouth to stifle a gasp. Hanging on a small hook by the door was a christening gown, its white fabric yellowed to the color of old cream, the delicate lace still perfect. This room hadn't been forgotten. It had been meticulously preserved. It was a pocket of the past, stitched into the fabric of my home without my ever knowing. The realization landed like a physical blow. Arthur had been in here. Over the decades, how many times had he slipped away, unlocking this door while I was asleep, or tending to my roses? The thought of his secret visits, His solitary communion with this hidden world created a chasm between us that felt wider than death itself. The man I had shared a bed with for 51 years had a whole other life, a whole other grief that he had never once let me touch. My gaze was drawn to a small, dark wood dresser in the corner. Unlike the rest of the room, which felt like a shared memory, the dresser felt like a vault. On its polished surface sat a single object, a cigar box. It seemed to hum with a silent importance, the focal point of the entire room. I moved towards it, my steps slow and deliberate, the scent of lavender growing stronger, as if emanating from the box itself. My arthritis-stiffened fingers fumbled as I reached for it. The wood was smooth and cool, unlike the rough, practical things Arthur usually handled. I lifted the lid, my heart hammering against my ribs. There were no cigars inside. Instead, my eyes fell upon a stack of faded, sepia-toned photographs. The top one was of a woman with dark hair and eyes that sparkled with a light I'd never seen before. She was beautiful, and she was a complete stranger. I lifted the first photograph. Beneath it was another. The same woman, this time holding a small girl with a riot of blonde curls, and standing beside them, with his arm around the woman, was Arthur. But it wasn't Arthur I didn't know. He was younger, his face unlined by the worries I had helped him carry, and he was smiling with an unreserved joy I had only seen in flashes. It was the smile of a man who believed life was perfect. With trembling hands, I set the photos aside. Underneath them were 2 documents, folded and brittle with age. I carefully unfolded the first. It was a marriage certificate from the state of North Carolina, dated 1 year before I met Arthur. The names read, Arthur Callahan and Eleanor Vance. The name felt alien on my tongue, a sound that had no place in my world. Yet here it was, legally bound to my husband. The second document was colder, more clinical. It was a death certificate. 2 names were listed, Eleanor Callahan, age 26, and Sarah Callahan, age 4. The cause of death for both was listed as automobile accident. The date was just 11 months after the marriage certificate was issued. A wife and a daughter. A whole family he had loved and lost, completely erased before my story with him even began. The foundation of my world didn't just crack, it turned to dust. The 50 years we'd spent together, the life I believed we had built from the ground up, was a lie. Not a malicious lie, perhaps, but a lie of omission so vast it swallowed everything. Every quiet evening, every sad look in his eyes that I had attributed to a long day's work, every time he'd held me just a little too tight, it all replayed in my mind, now colored by this devastating new truth. I wasn't his great love. I was his second chapter. The thought didn't spark jealousy so much as a profound, hollowing sorrow. He hadn't just chosen me, he had needed a replacement for a life that had been violently stolen from him. I sank onto a small, dust-covered child's chair by the dresser, the old wood groaning in protest. He hadn't shared his greatest pain with me. He had walled it off and built a new life around it, with me unknowingly living on the other side. Who was Eleanor? I stared at her, smiling face in the photograph, her eyes full of life. Had Arthur compared me to her? Was my cooking ever as good? Did I laugh at his jokes the same way she did? The questions were a poison, seeping into 5 decades of memories, tainting them one by one. I looked at the little girl, Sarah, with her blonde curls. We never had a daughter. Was that a pain he carried every time he looked at Robert? He had given me a good life, a life of quiet contentment and deep affection. I had never for a moment doubted his love, but was it whole? Or had I only ever received the part of his heart that hadn't been buried with them? The man of simple habits and honest words had harbored the most complex secret of all. He wasn't just my Arthur. He was Eleanor's husband, and Sarah's father first. My grief for him was suddenly complicated by a grief for them, for the life he'd lost, and for the life I'd unknowingly lived in the shadow of that loss. I felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, directed at the man I loved. How could he deny me the chance to help him carry that burden? Did he think me too weak? Or was the memory of them too precious to share with the woman who took Eleanor's place in his bed? My fingers traced the edge of the cigar box, seeking an answer that wasn't there. As I did, I felt a slight unevenness on the bottom. My heart skipped a beat. It was a false bottom. With a surge of adrenaline, I dug my fingernail into the seam and pried it up. Beneath it, nestled in the dark space, was a small bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The letters felt fragile, the paper almost translucent with age. I carefully untied the ribbon. The handwriting on the top envelope was feminine, elegant. The letters were from Eleanor's sister, addressed to Arthur in the months after the accident. My hands shook as I read the first few lines, a blur of condolences and shared memories. But then the words grew sharper, more pointed. The sisters' letters spoke of the accident, but not in the way a simple tragedy is spoken of. There were questions, hints of things left unsaid. "You know it wasn't just the rain, Arthur," one line read. "You can't carry that guilt alone." Guilt. The word leaped off the page. The accident wasn't just a tragedy he had survived. It was something he felt responsible for. Arthur, my steady, careful Arthur, carried not just sorrow, but the weight of blame. The man I knew was disappearing, replaced by a stranger haunted by ghosts I couldn't see. The quiet strength I had always admired now seemed like a prison he had built for himself, brick by brick, secret by secret. I sorted through the small stack, my vision blurred by tears. The pain was immense, a physical pressure in my chest. I felt like I was drowning in his past. At the very bottom of the bundle, there was one last letter. It was different from the others. The envelope was newer, the paper less yellowed. The handwriting was Arthur's, the familiar, slightly slanted script I knew, from 100 grocery lists and birthday cards. But this letter wasn't addressed to Eleanor's sister or anyone from that lost family. My breath caught in my throat. The letter was addressed to Robert, our son. The date in the corner was from just a month before Arthur died. He had written it, but never sent it. He had wanted to finally break his silence, to pass the story on. My fingers felt numb, cold, as I held the sealed envelope in my hands. This was it. This was the key to understanding. Not just his past, but my own. Why had he written to Robert and not to me? Was I to be kept in the dark forever? The silence of the house pressed in, and for the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt full of voices I couldn't hear, of secrets demanding to be known. I stared at my son's name, written in my husband's hand. This secret didn't just belong to Arthur anymore. It was a legacy, a final, complicated inheritance he had left behind. My earlier defiance, my fight against Robert to keep. The house now felt so small, so naive. The real fight was for the truth of the life I had actually lived. My resistance crumbled. I couldn't go back to pretending. I couldn't pack up my memories and move to a condo in Charlotte, leaving this unresolved. The call to change wasn't a choice anymore. It was a necessity. I had to know what he had written. I had to understand the man I had married, even if it destroyed the memory of him I held so dear. With a final, shuddering breath, I carefully broke the seal. The paper unfolded with a soft whisper. The letter was short, just a single page. My eyes scanned the lines, but it was the very first sentence that stopped my heart, that froze the blood in my veins, and that changed everything. Absolutely everything. It began, "My son, there's something you need to know about the day your mother and I met." My world, which had already shrunk to the size of this farmhouse, collapsed into the single sheet of paper in my hands. The words, "The day your mother and I met," were a lie I had lived inside for 51 years. I read the line again and again, as if staring at it long enough would change the ink, rearrange the letters into the story I knew. The story of a chance meeting at the county fair, of spilled lemonade, and a shared laugh under a string of colored lights. That memory, the cornerstone of my life, was a fiction Arthur had constructed. The scent of lavender and cedar in the room suddenly felt cloying, the air too thick to breathe. I sank back onto the small child's chair, the letter trembling in my grasp. My first instinct was a violent one, to destroy it, to take this single page, along with the photographs and certificates, and burn them in the old metal drum out back. I could erase this discovery just as Arthur had erased his past. I could go back to being the simple widow, tending her garden, living with the comfortable ghost of a man I thought I knew. The temptation was immense. A siren call promising the return of a piece that had just been stolen from me. But I couldn't. The truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. My hand, which had started to crumple the letter, slowly smoothed it out again. I forced my eyes to continue reading past that first devastating line. Arthur's familiar script laid out the real story. He had been drowning in grief, barely leaving the house for months. A friend, worried sick, had arranged a blind date for him at that very fair. But before he even met the other woman, he saw me. He wrote that he saw me serving lemonade at a church booth, my hair catching the afternoon sun, and he felt, for the first time since the accident, a flicker of something other than pain. It was a calculated deception. He'd approached my booth, feigned surprise, and invented a story on the spot. He never met his actual date. He chose me, not by chance, but with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a raft. The knowledge was a strange mix of poison and balm. He had lied to me, from the very first moment. But he had also chosen me with an intensity I never knew. The lie wasn't one of indifference. It was a lie born from a desperate, broken hope. My journey wasn't about uncovering a betrayal anymore. It was about understanding the man who was capable of it. The old routines of my life shattered. I no longer found solace in Arthur's armchair, or peace in the rhythm of weeding my garden. The entire house felt different, haunted not by his absence, but by the weight of his secrets. Every familiar object now posed a question. Did he buy this lamp because Eleanor would have liked it? Did he plant the honeysuckle for me, or for her? The silence I had grown accustomed to was now filled with the imagined whispers of a life I had unknowingly interrupted. My home had become a museum of a story I couldn't read. My new habit became this room. I spent hours here, not as a mourner, but as an archivist. I would sit on the floor, the cigar box open before me, studying Eleanor's face until I felt I knew the curve of her smile. I touched the small wooden toys, imagining the feel of Sarah's hands on them. I was no longer afraid of these ghosts. I was trying to learn from them. They held the key to the parts of my husband he had kept locked away. I was piecing together the man I married from the fragments of the man he had been. My grief transformed into a quiet, determined mission. I was no longer just waiting for my life to end. I was actively excavating its beginning. I had to know more than what was in these letters. I needed to hear a voice from that time, to find a living link to this buried past. A new mindset took hold, one of purpose. I wasn't just a widow protecting her memories. I was a historian fighting for the complete, unedited manuscript of my own existence before my son could tear the whole library down. In a small, leather-bound address book I found in the dresser, among names of long-dead hardware store owners and distant cousins, I found a listing for a Margaret Vance in Savannah, Georgia, Eleanor's sister, the woman who had written to Arthur with such a mix of compassion and accusation. A cold thrill, a mix of terror and hope shot through me. Was she still alive? Was she still at this address? For the first time in months, I felt a surge of energy that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the future. This new resolve was immediately tested. My old fears crept back in the dead of night. What if Margaret hated me? What if she saw me as the usurper who had taken her sister's place? The thought of hearing a voice full of 50 years of resentment was terrifying. The old Rosemary, the one who avoided conflict and cherished peace above all else, whispered that it was better to leave the past buried, to let the dead rest. But a new voice, stronger and more insistent, argued back. The living deserved the truth. The external conflict arrived right on schedule, in the form of a phone call from Robert. His voice was laced with that familiar, weary impatience. "Mom, I spoke to Brenda at the real estate office. She can come by on Friday to do the appraisal. Is that okay?" His words, once just a source of quiet pain, now felt like an attack. He wasn't just trying to move me. He was trying to bulldoze a history he didn't even know existed. He was an unknowing accomplice in the erasure of Eleanor and Sarah. Something inside me snapped. The years of quiet deference, of nodding along to his practical plans, fell away. "No, Robert, that's not okay," I said, my voice firmer than I had heard it in years. "We need to talk. There are things about this house, about your father, that you don't know." The line went silent for a moment. I could almost hear him pinching the bridge of his nose, a habit he had when he was frustrated. "Mom, please," he sighed, the dismissal clear in his tone. "Dad was a good, simple man. There are no secrets here. You're just emotional about leaving the house. And I get that, but we have to be realistic." His words, meant to be calming, felt like a slap. He called Arthur simple. The man who had orchestrated a new life out of the ashes of an old one, who had maintained a secret sanctuary in his own home for 5 decades, was anything but simple. My own son was invalidating my reality. His disbelief cemented my resolve. I was utterly alone in this quest. If I wanted answers, I would have to find them myself. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking not with fear, but with a cold, clear anger. I went to the small desk in the living room where we kept the laptop, a device I rarely touched. It took me the better part of an hour, but using the search engine, I looked up Margaret Vance of Savannah, Georgia. I found a listing for a retired librarian with that name. It had to be her. The next day was a trial. I wrote down what I would say on a piece of paper, my hand shaking so badly the words were nearly illegible. I rehearsed the opening line a dozen times, each one sounding more insane than the last. "Hello, you don't know me, but my husband was Arthur Callahan. How do you bridge a 50-year gap of silence and secrets with a single phone call?" I picked up the receiver and put it down 3 times, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Finally, I just dialed the number before I could lose my nerve. It rang 4 times, and on the 5th, a frail but clear voice answered. "Hello?" I took a deep breath. "My name is Rosemary." "Callahan?" I began, my voice a wavering whisper. "I believe your sister. Your sister was Eleanor." The silence on the other end was vast and heavy. I thought she had hung up. I was about to apologize and end the call when she spoke, her voice thick with an emotion I couldn't place. "I always wondered if this day would come," she said. "I've been waiting for this call for 50 years. The dam of my composure broke. I sobbed into the phone, a torrent of relief and grief and terror all at once. Margaret listened patiently, her silence now a comforting presence. We talked for over 2 hours. She filled in the story that Arthur's letters had only hinted at. The accident had happened on a rainy night, just like this one. They had argued. Eleanor wanted to visit her, and Arthur, tired from a long week, had resisted. He blamed himself. He told Margaret he had looked away from the road for just a second, distracted by their argument. That second had cost him everything. Margaret explained. His guilt was a living thing, a monster that had consumed him. He couldn't speak of Eleanor or Sarah because he felt he didn't have the right. To mention their names would be to confess his sin. The secret room wasn't just a memorial. It was a prison cell of his own making, where he went to serve a life sentence of grief. He hadn't hidden his past from me out of a lack of love, she explained, but because he was terrified that if I knew the broken, guilt-ridden man he truly was, I would leave. Him. Her words didn't excuse his lie, but they wrapped it in a context of profound human pain. The anger I felt towards Arthur began to dissolve, replaced by an overwhelming wave of empathy. I wasn't the second choice. I was the lifeline. He had built a new life with me not to replace the old one, but to prove to himself that he was still capable of creating something good, something that wasn't tainted by tragedy and guilt. He loved me enough to build a wall around his own heart to protect me from his demons. The next afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway. It was Robert, and a woman I recognized from a flyer as Brenda, the realtor. He hadn't listened. He had come to force the issue. He walked in, his face set with determination, and found me not in the kitchen or the garden, but sitting in the doorway of the open secret room, the cigar box on my lap. His eyes widened at the sight of the crib, the toys, the life he never knew existed. "Mom?" "What is all this?" he asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and irritation. Brenda hovered awkwardly at the bottom of the stairs, sensing she had walked into something intensely private. For a moment, he looked so much like his father. The same furrowed brow, the same way of standing when confronted with something he didn't understand. The old Rosemary would have shrunk under his gaze, would have apologized for the mess. But I was not the old Rosemary. I looked up at my son, my spine straight, the photographs of Eleanor and Sarah, resting in my hands. There were no tears in my eyes. My voice when I spoke was not frail or emotional. It was steady, calm, and weighted with the authority of a truth finally understood. I was no longer just the grieving widow he needed to manage. I was the guardian of a story that defined us all. I held up the single yellowed page of Arthur's letter. "This is your father's story, Robert," I said, my gaze unwavering. "And it's my story, too. It's the story of this house. And we are not selling one single floorboard. And Brenda is not taking one single step further until you sit down right here on this floor and understand every last word of it." I had found my voice in the silence of that room. The realtor, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, quietly excused herself and walked back to her car. Robert stood frozen, caught between his practical, forward-moving world and the sudden, immovable weight of the past. He looked from my face to the open room, to the letter in my hand, and for the first time I saw not impatience in his eyes, but a flicker of dawning comprehension. The battle for the house was over. The journey to understanding our family had just begun. I looked around the room, at the carefully preserved memories of a woman I'd never met and a child I'd never know. They were no longer strangers or rivals for Arthur's heart. They were family. By locking them away, Arthur had kept them from me. But by opening the door, I had finally brought them home. I was no longer just Rosemary Callahan, the widow. I was the keeper of the whole story, the matriarch of a family bigger and more complex than I had ever imagined. I was finally complete. My transformation was not loud or explosive. It was a quiet, internal shift, like the turning of a key in a lock that had been rusted shut for 50 years. I was no longer a woman defined by her husband's life or her son's plans. I was defined by my own search for truth. I watched Robert slowly, hesitantly, lower himself to sit on the floor across from me, his eyes fixed on the letter in my hand. He was finally ready to listen. Robert's gaze was locked on the single sheet of paper in my hand, his practical, ordered world teetering on the edge of this impossible revelation. He didn't argue. He didn't sigh with impatience. For the first time since he'd become a man of schedules and responsibilities, my son was completely, utterly still. I began to read, my voice steady, gaining strength with each word. Arthur had written the story of his first love, his profound loss, and the overwhelming guilt that had shadowed him for 50 years filled the dusty air of the hallway, weaving itself into the very fabric of our home. The letter was a confession, a plea for understanding. Arthur explained how he had seen me at the fair, a beacon of light in his suffocating darkness, and how he had made a desperate, selfish choice to build a new life without the baggage of his old one. He wrote of his fear, the paralyzing fear that if I knew the truth, if I saw the broken man he was, I would turn away. He feared that the ghost of his perfect, lost family would be too much for any woman to live with. He hadn't lied to hurt me. He had lied to keep me. As I read the final lines, where Arthur asked for Robert's forgiveness for his silence, a sound broke the stillness. It was a choked sob. Robert, my son who never cried, who faced business failures and life's challenges with a stoic resolve, was weeping. His head was in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of a grief he never knew he was entitled to. He wasn't just crying for the father he had lost, but for the father he had never truly known, and for the grandparents his own children would never hear stories about. In that moment, the dynamic between us shifted forever. I was no longer the fragile, elderly mother he needed to manage and protect. I was the keeper of our family's true history, the one who had unearthed the cornerstone, upon which our lives had been built. He looked up at me, his eyes red and raw with emotion, and the question in them was clear. What do we do now? It was the first time in a decade he had asked for my guidance, not just my compliance. My conquest wasn't over his decision to sell the house. It was over his perception of me. We spent the rest of that day, and the next, inside that room. It was no longer a forbidden place. It became a classroom, a chapel, a bridge between generations. Together, we carefully took every item from the dresser and the cigar box. I told him about Margaret, Eleanor's sister, and the conversation we'd had. He listened, not with the distracted air of a busy man, but with the focused intensity of a student discovering a subject that finally mattered. The house was no longer just an asset. It was an archive. The old Rosemary would have been terrified of this mess, of these painful emotions laid bare. She would have sought to smooth things over, to return to a quiet, predictable normal. But the woman I was now, the one forged in the discovery of this room, embraced it. I watched my son hold a photograph of Sarah, his half-sister, his fingers tracing the outline of her small, smiling face. He was connecting with a part of his own bloodline that had been denied to him, and I felt a profound sense of rightness, of a broken circle finally being mended. This transformation was not just internal, it began to radiate outward. Robert called his wife, Jessica, and spoke to her for over an hour in a low, emotional voice. When he hung up, he told me they were driving down from Charlotte with the children that weekend. "They need to know," he said, his voice thick with a new kind of conviction. "They need to see this. This is their history, too." The man who had wanted to erase this house was now the one inviting the next generation to learn its secrets. My intangible victory was the restoration of my own identity. I was no longer just Arthur's widow, a relic of a life that was over. I was Rosemary Callahan, the woman who had been chosen, the woman who had been loved so fiercely that a man built a wall around his own heart to keep her safe. And I was the woman strong enough to tear that wall down, not with anger, but with understanding. I had found a strength I never knew I possessed, a voice that had been quieted by years of gentle deference. Before, my days were a passive routine of remembering. Now they were an active process of integrating. I took the most beautiful photograph of Arthur and Eleanor and placed it on the mantelpiece in the living room, next to my own wedding photo. It wasn't an act of competition or resentment. It was an act of completion. It was a declaration that this family was built on more than one story, and that all its stories deserved to be honored. The contrast between the woman I was 6 months ago and the woman I am today is stark. The old Rosemary moved through her house like a ghost, haunted by memories. The new Rosemary moves with purpose, as the curator of those memories. I no longer feel the need to cling to every object for fear of forgetting Arthur. I understand him more deeply now in his absence than I ever did in his presence, and that knowledge is a comfort far more profound than any physical keepsake. Robert's reaction was the most tangible proof of this change. He stopped talking about condos and real estate agents. Instead, he started talking about repairs for our farmhouse. "We should fix that leaky gutter, Mom," he said one afternoon, standing on the porch. "And maybe we could refinish the floors in the hallway." He wasn't just preserving a property anymore, he was honoring a legacy. He saw the house not as my burden, but as our family's anchor. My personal reflection on this journey is one of gratitude. I am grateful for Arthur's desperate, complicated love. I am grateful for the pain of the discovery, because it led to a truth that was more enriching than the simple peace of my ignorance. I learned that a life isn't defined by the absence of secrets, but by what we do when those secrets come to light. We can let them destroy us, or we can use them to build a more honest, more complete version of ourselves. The woman who was afraid to answer her son's phone calls now speaks with a quiet authority that no one questions. The woman who thought her life story was finished has just written its most important chapter. I have conquered the fear of loneliness by embracing a family I never knew I had. My world didn't shrink when Arthur died. It expanded to include the past. and in doing so, it secured the future. This experience taught me that we are all living in houses filled with locked rooms. We have them inside ourselves, and we live with them in the people we love. We walk past those doors every day, respecting the locks, believing the stories we are told. We accept that some parts of a life, and of a heart, are simply not for us to know. We call it privacy or respect, but sometimes it is just fear. But the truth is, those locked rooms hold the very things that make us whole. They hold the griefs that shaped our loved ones, the choices that led them to our door, the silent burdens they carry. To ignore them is to love a person in part, not in whole. My greatest act of love for Arthur wasn't the 51 years I spent by his side. It was the act of opening that door after he was gone and choosing to understand him completely. The woman before this discovery was content with the story she had. She believed that a good life was a simple one, unburdened by complication or painful truths. She believed that love was a quiet, unbroken line. She was a gentle woman, a good wife, a loving mother, but she was living on the surface, tending a garden of beautiful flowers without ever knowing the complex, sometimes painful, network of roots that lay beneath. The woman I am now knows that roots are never simple. They are tangled and twisted, seeking nourishment in darkness, scarred by the rocks they have to push through. But they are what give the flowers their strength and their color. I am no longer afraid of the dark soil. I am no longer content to just live on the surface. I have dug my hands into the earth of my own life and have accepted all of it. My relationship with Robert has been reborn. We no longer talk about logistics and practicalities. We talk about feelings and memories. He asks me questions about my life before his father, about my own dreams and hopes. By uncovering his father's secret, he has discovered his mother as a whole person, not just a role she played in his life. The wall between us, built of unspoken things, has crumbled. The surprise in the community, what little of it I engage with, has been muted but noticeable. My neighbor, Carol, commented that there was a new light in my eyes. She was right. It's the light of understanding. It's the confidence that comes from knowing your own story from top to bottom, without any pages torn out. I am no longer just waiting. I am living, actively and with purpose. This farmhouse is no longer a mausoleum of memories. It is a living, breathing testament to a complicated, beautiful love story. 2 love stories, in fact. It is a place where my grandchildren will come and learn that life is not about avoiding pain, but about having the courage to face it, to integrate it, and to let it make you more compassionate, more whole. The greatest conquest was not over my son, but over my own fear of the unknown. I chose to turn the key. That single, simple act of courage redefined my past, reshaped my present, and secured my future. It transformed me from a passive recipient of a life story into its active author. I am the one who holds the pen now, and I am writing a new ending. This journey has taught me that every life is a mystery novel. We think we know the characters and the plot, but there are always clues. Hidden in plain sight, chapters we haven't read yet. Don't be afraid to look for the false bottoms in the boxes you inherit. Don't be afraid to turn the keys to the rooms that have been locked for years. The most profound message I can offer is this: your history, in all its messy, painful, and beautiful complexity, is not a burden. It is your strength. It is the soil from which you grow. To deny it, to lock it away, is to deny yourself the fullness of who you are and who you can become. The truth may shatter the world you thought you knew, but it will rebuild it on a foundation of solid rock. So, I sit here now, in Arthur's armchair, and I feel no loneliness. The room is not empty. It is filled with the presence of Arthur and Eleanor and little Sarah. They are not ghosts to be feared. They are family to be embraced. I have brought them out of the darkness and into the light, and in doing so, I have found my own way out of the shadows. My final act of transformation is one of peace, a deep, unshakable peace that comes from knowing the whole truth. I am 78 years old, and I feel as though my life has just begun. I am not just the end of Arthur's story. I am the guardian of all our stories, and I will spend the rest of my days making sure they are never, ever locked away again.